Hello, and welcome to another episode of Perspectives from the Informed Perspective. We're Penny and Jenny, and if this is your first time tuning in, we're very glad you're here. This podcast is a space where we explore what it means to build strong, thoughtful communities, ones grounded in our local lives, but enriched by the diverse perspectives we gather from around the world. As our name suggests, we believe meaningful change starts with listening, really listening, to voices, lived experiences, and perspectives that might challenge or expand our own. In each episode, we take a closer look at stories that spark reflection and help us rethink how we understand community, purpose, and impact. We explore issues rooted in the everyday realities of our communities, but with insights that cross borders and cultures. Our goal? To build empathy, broaden our understanding, and bring renewed value back to the places that we care about the most. We believe that only by engaging with different viewpoints can we make more informed choices individually and collectively. We embrace the complexity of human perspectives, the richness they offer, and the importance of respecting all people, regardless of viewpoint. Today's episode is all about a concept that's becoming increasingly important, not just for students, but for teachers, families, and school communities everywhere. Cultural fluency in education. So what exactly is cultural fluency? Cultural fluency is the ability to recognize, respect, and adapt to different cultural norms, values, and communication styles without losing your sense of self. It's about understanding how culture shapes the way we think, behave, and connect with others. It's about building trust across difference. In schools, that could mean a teacher adjusting how they communicate with families from different backgrounds, or students learning to collaborate on a group project with peers from different countries, or even recognizing when a cultural misunderstanding is creating friction, and knowing how to respond with empathy and curiosity. It's more than just celebrating International Day or learning a few phrases in another language. Cultural fluency builds bridges. It nurtures empathy. It prepares everyone, students and educators alike, to thrive in an interconnected world. And at its core, it's about creating learning environments where every voice is valued and respected. And here's why this matters. According to ISC research, there are now over 15,000 international schools worldwide, serving more than 7.7 million students. That's a 51% increase in just the last decade. While Asia continues to lead in numbers, new growth is happening in the sub-Saharan Africa, Eastern Europe, and Latin America. Meanwhile, a recent UNESCO report shows the number of internationally mobile students in higher education has more than tripled, from about 2 million in 2000 to nearly 6.9 million in 2022. Of those, over 4 million are studying in Europe or North America. According to the OECD, more than 1 in 10 students in higher education today is from overseas, and with them comes different expectations, communication styles, and cultural frameworks. So what does this mean? It means classrooms and even digital learning spaces are now more culturally diverse and more complex than ever. And that brings incredible opportunities, but of course, real challenges. And that's why cultural fluency is no longer a nice to have, it's essential. In international communities, cultural differences are everywhere, sometimes subtle, sometimes striking. A simple gesture, a nod, a pause, the way someone expresses agreement can mean very different things depending on one's background. Even everyday classroom routines carry layers of meaning. How students ask questions, how they respond to feedback, whether they're encouraged to speak up or expected to listen quietly. For example, in some cultures, students are taught to challenge ideas openly, and in others, respect is shown by listening and deferring to authority. Eye contact, personal space, or how respect is expressed can all vary. And those differences can lead to misunderstanding. But they offer a powerful opportunity to teach empathy, to spark curiosity, to help students and educators alike navigate cultural perspectives with understanding and respect, skills for the real world. Recognizing and exploring these differences isn't just about avoiding confusion. It's about creating inclusive classrooms where everyone feels seen, heard, and understood. So, today we're asking, what does cultural fluency actually look like in education? How do we teach it, not just as a lesson, but as a way of being? And how do social emotional learning, character development, and global citizenship all connect? After all, cultural fluency is the foundation of global citizenship, helping us connect, collaborate, and contribute responsibly wherever we are in the world. To explore these questions today, we are joined by two amazing guests, each bringing a unique lens on how schools can nurture cultural fluency, strengthen those relationships, and prepare students for a connected and complex world. But before we get going, we have a few quotes as ever to get us considering. Socrates: "We are not citizens of just our hometowns or nations, but of the world." Kofi Annan, the 7th Secretary General of the United Nations: "People of different religions and cultures live side by side in almost every part of the world, and most of us have overlapping identities which unite us with very different groups. We can love what we are without hating what and who we are not." Tyler Cowen, American economist and author: "Real cultural diversity results from the interchange of ideas, products, and influences, not from the insular development of a single national style." And attributed to the author Michel de Montaigne, "There never were in the world two opinions alike, no more than two hairs or two grains. The most universal quality is diversity." Robert Alan Arthur, American screenwriter and producer: "Cultural differences should not separate us from each other, but rather cultural diversity brings a collective strength that can benefit all of humanity." Stephanie Gilmore, an Australian surfer: "Experiencing different cultures is one of the best things a human being can do. It puts your whole world into perspective." And finally, Zaretta Hammond, educator and author: "Cultural responsiveness is not a practice. It's what informs our practice so we can make better teaching choices for eliciting, engaging, motivating, supporting, and expanding the intellectual capacity of all of our students." So without further ado, Jenny, could you please introduce our guests today?
For sure, Penny. So I'm really excited to be given space to this important topic and get two perspectives to really get our minds open to the situations we find ourselves in, and experiences we have. So first up, we got Katerina Gress-Wright, is a former English teacher and now a researcher at the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, in Paris, where she focuses on global citizenship, social emotional learning, and holistic child development. Raised between Denmark and the US and as a third culture kid, she's taught in state and international schools in Senegal, the US, and the UK. Her passion for nurturing thoughtful, global-minded students led her to complete a master's degree at the University of Oxford and University College London. At the OECD, she now designs resources for the world's largest international survey of social and emotional skills, exploring how traits like empathy, creativity, and self-control relate to outcomes like mental health, smartphone use, and career choices. And Dr. Charles Margerison is the founder of Amazing People Schools and Amazing People Worldwide, with a career dedicated to character education and intercultural learning. Author of over 30 books, he has also created the TMS Team Management Wheel and co-founded MCB University Press, now known as Emerald Publications. His innovations include Imagine Land for preschool learners and the Can Do Kids Band, a global resource for developing students' can-do spirit through music and storytelling. I'm sure we're going to have some amazing insights to share today. So back to you, Penny.
Great. I'm going to move up to Katerina first today. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I'm intrigued about your upbringing as a TCK, so third culture child. You have lived in many different countries. I think we've mentioned Denmark and the US and also in Africa, and you've taught in several international settings. I'd love to hear about those experiences and how they've shaped your approach to education and cultural fluency and global citizenship.
Thanks for the question, Penny, and thank you guys so much for having me. This is such an interesting topic, and I'm like sort of vibrating with excitement because I love talking about this. To be short, the short answer is these have had a really definitive impact on me in my life. So for anyone who doesn't know, so a third culture kid, it basically means a child who spent some of their childhood and adolescence in countries that are different from the countries of their parents. And originally the idea, I think it was invented in like the 90s, was supposed to describe like your kind of classic educated expat. So like the American child of a diplomat who's, spends time in schools like the Philippines or India. But I think as globalization has kind of gotten, and multiculturalism has gotten more diverse and there's more different types of it, I think you can kind of expand the idea to say, it's really anyone who has moved countries during their childhood and has therefore had to kind of go through that process of cultural adaptation to new environments and education systems. Because when I was a child, I was born in the US, moved to Denmark when I was 7. I never thought of myself as a third culture kid when I learned the term as a teenager, because I was like, oh, that's the jet setting crowd. Like I'm not that cool. Also because I was like, I was Danish and American, and those were the countries primarily I'd lived in. And it wasn't until I was an adult that like a friend and colleague said, wait a second, you're definitely a third culture kid. And I was like, oh yeah. And that was because I realized that by moving between those different countries, I had this mix of cultures, and I kind of, the idea of the third culture, right? That I wasn't just Danish or American. I kind of belonged, I felt an affinity with this like international community of other people and other kids who had also moved around a lot and had to go through that kind of cultural adaptation. And it has also meant that as an adult, that's kind of what I ended up seeking out. Like I have worked I always felt a bit out of place in environments that felt very culturally homogenous. And this is not to say that they weren't. When I taught in the US or the UK, like both places, lovely people, wonderful colleagues, but I always felt like there's a whole range of my world and experience that I'm not really using right now. And I always felt that I then gravitated and was not just happier, but I think of more value and was able to do more good in environments where there was a wider range of multicultural people from a variety of backgrounds. And that's where I felt most at home. And that's also why I'm now at the OECD, why I was in Senegal. So that I think so the third culture kid has really been definitive for me, but it's also, I think, and I reflect on this a lot as I kind of, because of the work I do on like social emotional learning and global citizenship and stuff, is like how it's shaped my worldview. And I think the first thing I feel like it's done, and I hope it's done, is empathy, is this idea of being maybe more aware of in any group, or like who might be feeling a bit like an outsider right now. Like what are all the kind of unwritten cultural norms or rules that the majority is taking for granted that is not obvious to someone who's coming from the outside. I think also a lot of humility, like per that not taking for granted, just, not assuming that everyone or myself knows everything. And then I think one of the things that's also really helped is, and I think this is really important today, is this like, on the one hand, this respect and love for what you might say is like the infinite variety of culture and diversity, right? Like just how rich and different people's norms and backgrounds and practices can be, but also at the same time, an appreciation for a sort of common and shared humanity. Like I think in this world where I think there's a lot of sort of quite kind of grotesque stereotyping happening in mass media or in political discourse, it's like you lose sight of the fact that like we all know in our own countries, our own communities, how diverse they are, like the range of personality types of people, the good community practices and cultural norms and the bad ones. And it's just kind of the recognition that every culture, every community has that. There is the full range of personality types and good practices and maybe not so good practices and that kind of, and change. So I think recognizing, and that sounds like such an obvious thing, but I think we sort of lose sight of it, that there's that, the diversity we know so well in our own lives and our own communities exists everywhere. And I think that's definitely something that being kind of a third culture kid and moving between places really kind of has brought home to me.
Yeah, I'm just sort of thinking like my kids have all grown up in countries that weren't actually where either I or my husband come from. So they're definitely third culture kids. And sort of thinking of the conversation of cultural fluency, I was thinking absolutely for kids in international schools, they've got to learn how to engage with other kids from all over the world. But actually, the more I kind of think about it, and what you were saying as well, when you were sort of talking about the more, not insular, but when you were working in the UK or the US in communities that maybe weren't quite so diverse, in a sense, I almost feel like that cultural fluency and global citizenship has potentially even more need in those environments, because our world is becoming more diverse, right? And because these kids potentially will go out into the big wide world and have many encounters, and maybe in that respect, kids who have grown up internationally or abroad have a privilege of already kind of naturally taking on a certain fluency without intention, because they're just exposed to it, right? Different cultures, different people, different languages. So I don't know what your thought is on that.
Yeah, I think so. And it also can be, I definitely think so, like that they have that kind of ability. And I think global citizenship is, needed everywhere. I think it is challenging though, because I think it, so much of this ties into like having an experience of something that's different from yourself. And so I think one of the challenges that a lot of educators feel like is, how do you introduce global citizenship in a very homogenous environment when maybe a lot of your students or even your faculty and teachers don't have a lot of experience of themselves? And so I think one thing is thinking about like cultural diversity, or cultural fluency can take lots of different shapes. It doesn't just mean somebody who has another passport than you do, or like or even another race. It can also be people who come from different parts of your own society. And it can be, and I think that's actually something that maybe the conversation sometimes miss. And I think especially today, where there's in some countries growing inequality and things, you can actually have surprising amounts of social segregation that then actually mean that maybe you don't have to go to another country to experience diversity. It's right there. Like an example. So when I started teaching in a low-income school in sort of semi-rural Connecticut, and I had gone to university to quite, you could say, kind of a sort of a posh or sort of a well-to-do like liberal arts college, just an hour's drive away. And then when I got assigned to teach in this school, I was just like, I feel like I've stepped into another universe. Like this is just an hour from where I studied at university, but it just feels like totally different worlds, and the people and their life trajectories and their experiences are so different. And so I think maybe also we can maybe kind of expand our concept of global citizenship or cultural fluency to not just be, it has to be somebody who comes from literally another part of the world in another country. It can also be, and I think this is maybe something that's really important right now, is to think about what are the different cultures in my own society, and who am I not talking to, and who can I engage with? And I think that's really important. And I do think that third culture kids, I think, maybe have a natural advantage to help it start, maybe initiate those processes, because exactly, they often tend to be people who don't take for granted that there's just one way of doing things and one culture, and it's just very homogenous. I think so they can maybe be a great place to sort of start to raise that awareness of what diversity is there.
And I feel like politically in the world currently, these sort of conversations, you're saying, there's other within your own country, there's these cultural differences or whatever else, but it's also your neighbor. Like you might not be talking to your neighbor. So it's taking it down to its basics, right? Why does this person have this opinion? Why do they act like they do?
Yeah. I think that's a great place, especially for kids and families, where you feel like all this stuff can feel so big and like abstract. Is like, start by kind of, what's the diversity in your own backyard? Like, who are the neighbors or the people you can start talking to who maybe have had actually a surprisingly different life from yours?
Yeah. We recently spoke to another individual who does projects where they create books within schools, and they go into the schools, and then they get the teachers and also the students in the class to share their own story. And it's only a short experience, but each of them writes it down. And he just said it's absolutely fascinating. Suddenly these kids are hearing what their teachers experienced in their life, that maybe they've come from another country, maybe they've experienced hardship. And suddenly it's not just Mr. Smith or whoever else it might be. It's actually, wow, this is a person. And the same for other kids in the class. Maybe there's one kid who's being bullied the whole time, but when they actually hear the story, behind it, then maybe it's opening their eyes up just to that sort of human level of understanding why a person is how they are.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll make this one point, and then I'll let the conversation move on. I was just the other day, right now I'm doing research on empathy and like, how do you teach empathy? And one thing that's coming up very consistently is storytelling. And it's language and it's storytelling, and which makes sense because I studied English literature, and that's kind of also my passion still. And it's just the idea that it's not enough to have a facts about people. You've really got to put it in context and tell a narrative that allows and helps children or families or individuals sort of really try to put themselves in the shoes of the person and understand how their decisions and how their life has evolved. And so it makes complete sense what you're saying, that example. And it also makes me think of an example in Denmark where they had this idea of human libraries, where they would bring people in, like adults from different backgrounds. They would sit them down, and basically children could go from one person to the other and hear their stories on, and I don't know if they gave them prompts or whatever, but it was, again, this idea of like sharing stories. And that really is one of the most powerful vehicles for empathy.
Yeah, we come back to that time and again, don't we, Jenny? The strength.
I love broader considerations because it's, you know, it can be just different practices in the same communities, you know, that goes into beliefs, you know, and talking about how to foster empathy, it's you know, it's how you can relate to it. But that might, you know, come down to everyone's basics like food, and how that can differ in different households, you know, based on heritage and beliefs. And I had to go on mute for a while then because the church next to me was, you know, chiming its bells. And it's the environment you live in, and as you said, what you're surrounded by, and you know, it's so much broader than just the country that you're in or the country you've experienced, and those cultures, I think, as well. So it's really good to start thinking, you know, once you start, you can go really, really broad with all the influences.
And also, I think also the intergenerational conversation is important, like, you know, talking to the elderly as well, like, you know, different generations learning from one another. I think that's also another part of that conversation. Katerina, I wanted to ask you, you study social and emotional skills at the OECD. Can you tell us a little bit about that? I mean, what I was reading, it's how they can also influence things like your mental health and your potentials in life for success, jobs, screen time even. Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Yeah, so social emotional skills, it goes by a lot of different names that are kind of maybe not identical, but all related. So it's, you know, it can be called 21st century skills or character education or life skills. So it's sort of a cluster of ideas. And these are basically skills. They're not your kind of classic academic skills like literacy or numeracy. They're the kind of holistic stuff that shapes your life, both personally and professionally. And it can be things like empathy, self-control, so the ability to manage your attention and your focus on tasks and get tasks done. It can be tolerance, it can be creativity, it can be responsibility, those sorts of skills. And so basically I work on a survey where we assess upwards of 70,000 15-year-olds and 10-year-olds. In last round was 15 countries. And we basically sort of try to get a sense of not exactly like how are these skills doing in children across these different contexts, you know, from Colombia to India to Italy. And then we also sort of then compare it, say, okay, well, what do these skills influence? Like mental health, academics, like grades. And we found that it influences lots of things. It is definitely related to grades and academic performance, because if you think about it, a child who can't sort of knows how to direct their attention is not going to be able to get their homework done. And you know, a child who struggles with empathy, like struggles to understand social cues from their peers or from their teacher, is going to struggle to make good relationships in class, is going to struggle to get along with their teacher perhaps. So these skills really are very foundational to academic learning, and they are foundational to mental health. So things like emotional regulation and a self-awareness. So the ability to recognize your own feelings, name and understand those feelings and what is shaping them, and then choose appropriate strategies to both manage your negative feelings when you have them, but also to maybe sometimes like manage positive feelings, like in the sense of, you know, if you're feeling down, how to make yourself feel better, or if you're super excited, but it's like a kind of a serious event, like to maybe be able to tone down your excitement a little bit, not to just to adjust to the environment. So things like that are really important for mental health. And so, yeah, and not just our research, but lots of other research kind of confirms this, that, and this is not to say that, like, you know, the basics of teaching a kid how to read and write are not important. They absolutely are. But I think the more we learn about what's called the science of learning, like how people and children learn, the more we realize this is a social and emotional process. And you cannot learn academically, you cannot learn these social skills outside of interacting with other people. And so you need to address and nurture those things precisely if you want a child or a person to be well adjusted and able to, to realize their potential, to kind of to become the kind of well adjusted functioning adults and community members that we want them to be.
I know that you're involved in like the curricular design as well, so you've got knowledge about that. I mean, what is the ideal? It should be interwoven, these skills that we're talking about, whether it's emotional regulation or fluency, cultural fluency skills. Are they things that should be deeply woven into every lesson, or it would be better as a, a single subject that is being given to the, I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
This is exactly a question that people are kind of trying to figure out. And I think basically it's most effective. There's a couple components that make it effective. One is it helps when it's integrated into academic lessons. It maybe doesn't need to be every single lesson, but I think that when kids see its relevance and how it applies to their day-to-day life, and especially consistently, that's really important. Whole school, when the whole school is involved in it and doing it together, I think that's really important. But that makes sense. Like if when it comes to classroom management or discipline, like if one teacher is doing one thing and no one else is doing it, the kid gets very mixed signals, and it might be like, well, why then? And it's harder for them to absorb the lesson. I would say, but I think another thing that research has kind of come to agree on is that for making social emotional learning effective, it can't just be like, oh, it's sort of there in the ether. We just sort of like, kids will learn empathy because we tell them to be nice to each other. Like it has to be it has to be explicit. Like you have to talk about empathy. You have to teach it and teach the strategies to do it. So it needs to be explicit. It needs to be so the acronym is SAFE, SAFE. So sequenced, active, which means kids have to do it. Like they can't just be like, oh, let's have a nice conversation about empathy. They have to like do activities that require them to think about other people's perspectives and to learn to sort of have that sympathy for other people and compassion. That has to be like, I think focused so that it's targeted. Again, it's not just it's going to happen in ether. And like I said, it needs to be explicit so that you use the terms and you talk about it explicitly. And if you do those things, I think that plus doing it at a school level, and then I think integrating the things you teach into your academic lessons, that is sort of the magic thing that really makes it powerful and effective.
Yeah.
And for me, it's encouraging to hear that, because as you were talking, I can't help, but think about my own children and, all the stuff that I want to equip them with. And it puts a lot of pressure on the parents. Like, we mentioned this podcast is, for adults and typically parents, and you hear these perspectives, you learn these things, you've got your awareness, and then you think, okay, I need to do that with my child. But it's a lot, and it's to hear that there's, the research and the recommendations from the education setting, because education is holistic. It's not just at school and it's not just at home, and it needs that unity essentially. And I think it's, for anyone listening, who's inspired by it or can see the relevance and the need, which is hopefully obvious. It's, the school setting is so important, but what you can do at home as well to help.
Yeah, I would say actually one other thing, that reflection, conversations with kids where you try to get them to think about what they've learned and the strategies they use. So for example, self-control, like that ability to focus on the task right in front of you. One way to help teach little kids that kind of, kindergarten, elementary, is to play games like freeze, or, games that require them to listen to instructions and then change tasks and adjust what they're doing. So it really requires them to pay attention. But the research shows that it's not just enough to play that game. You have to then have a conversation with the kid afterwards where you think, well, what did you do to make sure that you listened and you did it when you played Simon Says, that you did the right thing at the right time? And it's that also component of reflection and kind of metacognition, getting them to think about the process of learning, that is really crucial for social emotional learning of any kind.
That's what we do with our tween talk, actually, that this is our, we set up this third space for tweens from 9 to 13-year-olds. And that was ultimately because they want to talk at that age. They have so much they want to say. They've touched on stuff at school, but they haven't been able to run with it. They want to go somewhere and go into more depth in it, or just want to be heard. What is their opinion on what they've touched on at school? And that is exactly that, like continuing that conversation. The other thing I was thinking as well is that religion in international schools, and I don't know if it's just the schools that we happen to have been in around the world, but that seems to have not really be on the curricula anymore in the same way. And I remember when I was at school, we went through every religion. Like we did Buddhism, we did Hinduism, we did Catholicism, we did it all. And regardless of whether you are religious or not, I think that's also that awareness. And I've seen that with my kids sort of asking me these questions, and I'm thinking, oh gosh, yeah, they're not actually doing that anymore. And that seems also a conversation that I think is still really important that the children ought to be having.
No, I agree, because also, religion, whether you're practicing or not, is such a big part of a culture. I mean, I'm not a practicing Christian, but I have grown up in a Christian culture, and it definitely shapes, very superficial stuff to like what holidays I take for granted, but also like values and kind of assumptions about how to think about other people, how to sort of understand my relationship with the world. And so I think it's really important. And I think it has all religions have a profound influence on their cultures. And so I agree that I wonder if it's sort of like, because it can be maybe a bit of a sensitive issue, there's a bit of a stepping back from it, which is a pity, because I think a big role that schools and also maybe families, but especially schools, can do is help children learn how to manage sensitive conversations and how to approach these big and complicated topics with a degree of a sort of humility and respect. And like you said, sort of like love what the Kofi Annan quote, like loving yourself without hating what you're not. And I think so it's in a way, I think it's a pity to move away from teaching things like religion, because I think that's a missed opportunity.
Learning about yourself, which I just wanted to touch on from what we were talking about earlier, is like, from a parenting perspective, your child needs to learn about themselves, but you're also learning about them, and that reflection that you can do. And I often think of it, like I said, I think of my own situation, and that's predominantly a parent role at the moment, and I'm still learning, and I reflect, and if things don't go to plan, or I wish I'd responded better, or we just reflect together, and I'm like, right, let's work on that. But then jumping, I think, to that religion point of view, it's more holistic for me as well. It's like everyone has different beliefs and values, and religion has a role in that. But one thing I keep saying to my 6-year-old at the moment, when he comes up across comments, and it's a bit of a excuse, not excuse, but it's my kind of get out thing. I was like, that's their belief. That's their belief, and if it's like a word you shouldn't say, be it a swear word or describing someone as something, I just say that they think that's okay to say, or they believe that's okay to say, but we don't, or we do this, and it's trying to just teach him from that fundamental level that everyone is different, and obviously that can expand to how you look and how you think, but I think that's nice.
Now I feel I have to move on to Charles, because everything that we've spoken about, I feel like he's already like doing anyway. So Charles, I mean, you're doing some amazing things, and you work with Amazing People's Schools, which I think you founded, and Can Do Kids worldwide, and you have impacted classrooms in so many countries all over the world. How about telling us a little bit about that? I know we were saying about storytelling, and I think that's one of the things that you use very well, to use that with virtual travel experiences as well to help kids develop that cultural fluency and character.
Yes, very interested to hear the conversation and the experiences, both personal, moving from country to country, as well as the research. Where I come into the equation is that I've always been interested in translating ideas into action. So what would be the implication? And in terms of my sort of philosophy, I developed an idea called conversology. That is the study of conversation. So if you can study sociology, psychology, biology, why can't you study conversation? And that's where I started with my PhD, listening to what the concepts of the children were. They were about 9 and 10. And at that time, the British government had put out a policy saying that all primary school children should know about parliament and democracy, which are pretty big ideas. And the headmaster of the school said that he had to do it, but he wasn't really sure that they would really understand it. And I happened to meet him and said, well, why don't we actually practice it by going in on a weekly basis, and we'll construct our own society. So that really became the basis. I may have just lost. I'm going to have to plug in my. I'm just going to lose. I'm going to lose power, so I'm just going to switch on the power. There we go. So I got into this very much in a pragmatic way, and subsequent to that, I've always looked for ways in which we could actually give the students something to do as opposed to just talking about it. So in the case of the Can Do Kids, we have a website where there are a number of countries. They can choose which country they want to go to, or the teacher does. And then they see a video, which is 5 minutes, about the culture of the country, the sport they play, the languages, the sort of way of life. And then I encourage the teacher, rather than teaching, just say, put the kids into groups of 3 or 4 and say, now I've seen that video, what would I like to do when I go to that country? Develop a travel plan. Would I like to go and see the countryside or the environment? Would I like to go and taste the food? So the whole idea is that the children are making up their own plan rather than being taught about the country. So what we found is that they get very engaged, and particularly in schools where there is a high measure of cultural mix. What I mean by that, a UK school for the moment, on average, if you go into the average UK school, there would be children from the West Indies, Caribbean, Pakistan, India, Africa, and therefore you don't really have to, inverted commas, teach intercultural difference, because the children, if given an opportunity, will talk about the countries from which their parents come and where they've been to visit their grandparents, whatever it is. So what I try to do with my team is say to them, look, just let's create a framework, an edutech framework as it is, because it's all on the web and we provide the facilities. Then the teacher, in effect, becomes a facilitator rather than the teacher, and they get the children to talk about their experience. For example, we have one on Spain, one on France, and we get the kids, have you ever been to France on holiday? Have you been to Spain? Has anybody been? And what did you find? What was it like? And so the essence of it, in my view, is conversation. And that is how we do that. And we also do the same with amazing people. So rather than try to teach them the necessarily of how to be amazing, we bring people like Nelson Mandela, Harriet Tubman, Marie Curie, people who achieved in their life, and we say, well, what do you think that they actually did in order to become amazing? Because they weren't amazing when they were born. They were just like you are. And you obviously begin to learn. In the case of Marie Curie, she picked herself up from Poland, where you are, and decided to go off to France because they wouldn't allow her to go to university in Poland in those days. And the kids begin to think, wow, that's fantastic. Maybe I should go to another country and begin to learn. So we're not there in the role of preaching or even teaching. We're in the role of facilitating, and based on a theory which I developed or learned from a guy called Dr. Roger Evans, is that you start with the action and then you do the learning. In the old day, when I went to school, maybe when you went to school, you had to start with the learning by the teacher teaching you, and then you went and applied it. Reg Evans said, no, in life, most of us actually start with action and we learn from the action. So I've tried to do that, but I have to say that I found it very hard to get teachers to do that. They still want to go back and teach.
Yeah, and we've spoken a lot about the education system and how that change is very slow to be engaged with or to be able to facilitate. And it's a challenge, but the amazing work that people like you are doing as well. And I love, for me, the conversation. It's curiosity. If you're nearly said forced, I don't want to say forced. If you're encouraged to start a conversation, ask questions, receive questions, and respond. There's that curiosity. There's that. You have to really think about what you've experienced, or what there is that you've taken from it. When you said, oh, what do you know about France and Spain? Have you been? I can imagine if kids have been on holiday, they'd be like, oh, we went to the beach. How do you get to that next level of detail? Once again, hopefully probably a bit hungry if I keep talking about food, but what did you eat? How is it different? Did you realize, okay, yeah, you probably had a load of other chips, but what was like your mum or dad eating? And and it's that. And I think it's such a simple idea, but what a great facilitation. And as Penny touched on, certain age kids, and well, any age kids can love to talk given the chance.
But I think it's also
in the terms of conversology, what I've been doing is working with teachers and beginning to say, look, at what level within 1 hour, because that's what normally a lesson might be, 50 minutes. First of all, what percentage of the time does the teacher talk and what percentage do the students talk? And I've been trying to reverse the normal trend, or the old trend, which was 80% teacher, 20% students, to 20% student teacher and 80% students, and actually getting the teachers to measure that and just saying at the end of the class, how much time did I get the children to converse? Because that is the essence of conversology, learning by talking. Now, in that, I've also tried to get them to look at major concepts which make a difference. And the one you've just referred to there would be a good example, like how much of it is general conversation and how much is it specific. So you may say, yes, I went to the beach in France, but specifically, what did you learn? And the teacher can facilitate that by beginning to get the students to say, well, let's now write down something specifically as opposed to the general. Like the weather was very nice. Yes, we would always talk about the weather. But specifically, what did you learn as a result of the fact that the weather was either good or bad? And then going on to things where, again, getting the kids to think about the conversation rather than just the country. Like, how much of what you've just said is opinion and how much is fact? And how could you convert an opinion to fact? How would you do that? Or how would you convert a fact to an opinion? So the students become very interested, particularly the older ones, not so much the younger ones, but they begin then to say, oh, that was a very interesting point of view you gave there. Could you give me an example? Which is getting to the fact. And the more we are enabling the students to develop these conversational skills, the more they're learning.
I just saw that you'd shared something this morning, Charles, about how you've had Lucy Staniforth, the UK, the England football player, doing a piece for you on mental health. And that was like a little video shot that I saw. And I also thought that's also a lovely sort of comprehensive, you talked about the historical figures that you've also used through stories, but also bringing people in the present day, like people who the kids are really potentially following or fans of in the current day, and being able to then take a conversation like mental health and saying, this can affect anyone, no matter who you are, where you come from, what your background. I love that. I think that's really valuable, because a lot of it is like, how do you reach the kids as well, right? How do you engage that, get that information that we've been talking about? And if that's a way to get through to them, then I think that's really powerful.
What we're doing in order to do that is to develop partnerships. And I've encouraged my team to make partnerships with organizations who are very different from ourselves. So that particular partnership is with an organization called Virtual Soccer Schools, which was started by the captain of the Chelsea Football Club, together with a teacher in the UK. And they found us because they said, oh, we need educators who know something about character education, because we want to get the children to be mentally tougher, and we want the children to think through the decisions they're making in terms of food, in terms of training. Who can we have? And my colleague who runs the operation, the business in the UK, is a lady called Frances Corcoran. And our teacher over there is a lady called Selena Whitehead. And they started to talk with the organizer of Virtual Soccer Schools. And we suddenly realized that it was really a partnership of our equal strengths. And now we've had tremendous, I mean, we're talking numbers which I couldn't believe. We got up to 900 schools switching in, tuning in. And it depends on the day and the time. You know, if you've got the right day and the time, you can. This one, I think, got up to the one you're referring to. They had over 450 schools. And it's just amazing to me how, if you've got the right topic and you've got something that the teachers think that would be of interest. So if you turned up or I turned up, I presume they might get 10 schools. If you bring a footballer along, you can get 900 schools.
And it makes me think as well, we're talking about, you know, different cultures and bringing together and understanding, and sport can be so pivotal in that, you know, in you know, bringing community and connections and, you know, learning from it. And then if you can take those stars, so to speak, and, you know, connect with young people in you know, further education, it's incredible. It's so powerful.
It's also particularly interesting internationally, because when I started all this, I thought it was very Western centered, the idea, the people who were involved, William Shakespeare, Marie Curie. We had some people from different cultures, but in that they were mainly American, Harriet Tubman and so forth. So I tried to widen it. And then one day, a guy came along and he said, well, how would this apply to the Middle East, to countries like Jordan, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, particularly where there's expatriate population? I said to him, well, by all means, you know, let's have a partnership. And he's been very successful in taking this resource into schools and into culture that I would thought would not have initially been welcoming. But he is telling me he's getting amazing results because, and I think here's my theory anyway. My theory is that it's very difficult these days to talk religion in schools, but you can talk character. And the essence of the Ten Commandments, for example, is all about character. Now, I think in the Muslim faith, the same principles in their countries, you can have a strong religious element. But even so, there is this issue. They want to make this more than just a religious issue. And the issue then becomes, what kind of a person are you? How you're developing your own self strengths. And that becomes an issue of character. So I think that what I see happening, and it'd be very interesting to get Catherine's view on this from the European perspective, is the extent to which character education is featuring in European schools.
Well, it's an excellent question. My sense is, I think it depends on where you are, and kind of, because I think there's a lot of, because there's an interest in social emotional skills, I think there is an interest in character. I think, you know, sometimes what varies is the extent to which I think schools or cultures or schools or institutions have kind of the courage to admit the role of values in it. Because I think the reason some schools, and in Europe maybe they kind of shy away from the term character education, is because there's an assumption that it's first of all, it's maybe very conservative or traditional, and maybe not all kind of schools want to sort of have that kind of to have a perception that's maybe not always a good thing. And there's also a kind of concern of, I think, precisely maybe because of concern about cultural diversity, sometimes a worry about, oh, we can't talk about values, we can't talk about virtue, and character has kind of this morally loaded term. And so I think sometimes there's a desire to kind of shy away from it. But I think per the conversation with things like social emotional learning, it's starting to make a bit of a comeback, I wonder, in some forms. And I think and actually getting back to what we were saying earlier about, being able to have difficult conversations and sensitive conversations. I think that I hope in some ways that conversations about character education and character will start to come back, because I think everyone, per the success of your program, like, people are interested in this and it matters, right? What can you do? How can you take some control of your own life and learn and develop the capacities to accomplish the most that you want to accomplish with your life, or that will, is meaningful for you. And
one of the things that we've done is and we've been working with a school in the UK on this, where I put up the idea, why don't we have an amazing people day? Our organization is called Amazing People Schools, and every school is really there to develop amazing students. So I put up the idea for an Amazing People Day. One of the schools said, we like that. We think it's a good idea. We're going to invite all of our students to turn up as an amazing person of their own choice. And we had, sorry?
Yourself. Everyone should come as themselves.
Yes. Well, they could do, or they could choose to become Marie Curie, or they could be Charles Dickens, or they could be a local footballer, or they could choose, their grandfather who fought in the war, or whatever it was. And we left it to the school to decide the day and how they wanted to run it, and we just facilitated. We were supporters in terms of the idea and the structure. And what we found was that it released amazing creativity, the parents getting involved, dressing up their kids, deciding who they want to. And all of the kids then came along having researched the character they were representing. And the discussion then came in schools as to why they had chosen these people. It did come down to character. They respected their perseverance, or the way where they created scientific breakthroughs, or they'd been brilliant on some medical or indeed in case of some children, talking about their relatives and how they had respected what they had done in their life. So we've actually brought it to life rather than it just being a conceptual idea.
I think that bringing it to life, you made me think of a couple things. I think there's sort of two wonderful things happening. I think the open one is the openness with which you let the kids sort of choose who they want to be as an amazing person, because that also makes me think that, like, and letting them choose things from maybe their own life, whether it's their grandparent or their parents or something like that. Because when I was teaching in London, it was inner city London. It was a school that I would say was sort of majority kids from the Middle East, and sort of many born in the UK, but their families had come from elsewhere. And what struck me when I was there was, the curriculum, because I was an English teacher, was very focused on kind of the British classics. Like, we're going to do Shakespeare every year for 7 years. We're going to do Dickens, so much Dickens. And I remember trying to teach kids some creative writing. It was our year 9s, so about 13. And I was given this sort of very generic, like, framework to teach them. And I was just like, let's change this. Let's have a conversation about your background. I think they had to write like a horror story or something like that. And I was like, okay, fine. But let's start with the setting that you guys know. And we started having a conversation about, like, where did you grow up? And like some of them, it was like the local council estate down the street. And so, like, it was amazing to me the degree to which these kids were like, it had never occurred to them that their own world and story was worth telling, and that their environment was interesting, because the narrative they had maybe inadvertently gotten was, to be amazing or interesting, you have to be part of the classic British canon of authors, or you have to be kind of extraordinary, like your experiences have to be unusual. And as a consequence, when they were doing things like creative writing, they were writing this horrible generic drivel, because they didn't think that they could tap into their own experience. And so I think this, I think actually that's really important for things like character education or social emotional learning is, it starts a lot with self-awareness and starting to like pay attention to your own life differently. And because you can learn to do that, you then are able to maybe have a better job and do a better job of paying attention and observing and learning from other people. And I think so I think that was a really cool thing that it sounds like you're doing with this Amazing People Day. So
I like that.
And we're trying to extend it. When I say trying, we are doing it, but we'd like to do it on a much wider scale with the countries. So most students have not travelled. And I noticed, just because I'm on LinkedIn, and it was good that you picked up, but I do notice some of the schools are being selective and taking a small number of the kids, particularly from the UK. I noticed one recently had taken their students over to the Netherlands. And it struck me really that out of a school of 1,000 students, probably only 10% would be able to go. So what I've been developing is trying to get the idea that students can travel virtually and begin to reflect on, well, that is something when I get a little bit older, I'll actually do in real time. In other words, it's only, 6-7 years before they become 18 or 19. And I notice here in Australia, and you probably notice it where you are, the more and more students who are 18, 19, taking a gap year and doing the travel in order to get some cultural experience. And I have really begun to make the link between what we're doing with helping children with the Can Do Kids Band, which is the entertainment of wherever they go, they meet students, and the local students tell them all the tips of where to go. And so it's very much trying to get kids to learn by virtual involvement, but then beginning to plan out and say, wow, when I'm 18 or 19, I'm going to do that for real.
Yeah, that's really interesting, though, that you're touching on like studies and gap years and things, because actually really recently, it's just a personal experience, but we went to Vienna University and I went with my kids. So I have a 6-year-old and an 11-year-old, and there are another couple of friends with their kids. And that was just down to the chance that one of my friends, he's a lecturer there, and he said, bring them along. I'll show them the campus, the uni campus. And I was thinking to myself, what are they going to do at the uni campus? They're not going to be interested. So off we tootled down there, and he took us into the lecture halls and took us into a room where he teaches, and he showed them everything and the library, and they were fascinated, and I would never have imagined it. They were asking all these questions, and my daughter after was like, right, now I know where I want to go to university, that's where I'm going to go. And I thought, that is exactly that. We don't have a conversation about university, what it really looks like when they're, younger than 16 normally. It's normally, you get to 16, 17, like, oh gosh, where am I going to study? What am I going to do? But just having that, like, short experience, but potentially giving them fire and passion for something that they might not otherwise have even thought about. Why am I at school? Where's this going to take me? So I love that sort of, giving them different experiences, even if that is the virtual experience.
And it's inspiration as well, isn't it? Because then they can be inspired to have that experience, to be inspired by what that means to them, and what, maybe what had they thought of university. Or often university, I believe, is clouded about what you're going to study, maybe not the in-person experience of, that campus that has clearly inspired your daughter, like, to be in a setting that's excited you like that, regardless of what you're going to study, I'm sure she'd, prosper completely there because she, had such a good reaction to it. But I love the in this day and age, we talk about the lack of kind of in-person connection, but we can't ignore the value of the interconnection thanks to digitization. And, you know, the fact that we can, you know, I feel very blessed that my children are having an overseas experience, international expat life. They're meeting people from all over the world. Yes, it's hard when people move on, move home. We don't know when we'll see our friends who've moved back to New Zealand again, if ever. But, and Penny has, you know, relate to this with an older teenager. You know, they know people across the world, or even if they've just, you know, done an online experience. You know, like you're facilitating, Charles, they've had that insight into somewhere else, and the curiosity there. You know, you talk about countries, or, you know, you actually just, you know, I was trying to get my littlest to sleep the other night, and I started telling him a story, and I told him a story about Sri Lanka, and I actually realized so I lived there when I was little, and we went back when his brother was one and he was in my tummy. So I started telling, and I realized I'd never spoken to him about it. And he had all these questions. I was like, oh, this is a bad idea. He's meant to go to sleep. I was like, it was wonderful because he was like, what was it like? And and all these questions. And I've kind of just glossed over having those moments to explore things with him and share things with him because life's busy.
What about pen pals? Like right back in our day, that was the thing, you know, you suddenly got, you know, the name of a child somewhere in the world and you started writing to them, and that exchange, you know, even that was so valuable, sort of just hearing about what their day-to-day life is like and how different that can be from your own, right?
I think it's interesting you mentioned it because I actually remember, and you made me think of, I did have a pen pal for a little bit when I think he was a Dutch kid when I was like 14 or something like that. Anyway, but it was, you made me think because like you mentioned sort of digital technology, and it's, you know, there's a lot of anxiety right now about like, oh, you know, devices, smartphones, they're causing disconnection, they're making it switch off. And like, there's definitely, I think, yes, I think especially for children, like they need to be sort of, there's evidence is emerging that it needs to be managed, and you know, there's good and bad ways to do it. But I will also say that there actually are a lot of ways that it can be a really positive thing. And you know, there's like, I was just reading yesterday, I was reading some new stuff from the OECD on loneliness and social connection and digital devices, and they were basically saying that, you know, where it's interactive, where you have kids chatting, you know, doing video chats or calls or texting or things like that, that actually can be really sort of help them cultivate these relationships. And again, like, and also finding affinity groups. Like if you are, you know, an LGBTQ kid, or you're from some kind of minority and you've always felt a bit like an outsider where you are, and you don't have immediate in-person access to kind of people that you feel are kind of your tribe or that share your interests or your kind of this part of your identity, the online place can really be a great place to find that. And also thinking what you're saying, Penny, I'm also about pen pals, like you know, I think the idea of, especially in places that are maybe more homogenous, using technology to connect with, like, whether it becomes like a sister school in some other country, like I can see a lot of good ways that technology can help young people sort of learn to talk to and interact with people from other places and other backgrounds, even, I mean, not another country, but just a different community. And so I sort of also sort of say, like, even as we need to kind of think carefully about when and how we let kids use technology and devices and things like that, I think there is also some definite potential positives to it that can really facilitate cultural fluency and help kids feel more connected.
Definitely.
Be curious, Katerina, from your studies and stuff, was resilience something that came up, you know, having to find ways to support? I know that's something, Charles, that you've mentioned, that you know, your programs, you know, put a lot of emphasis on resilience and that can-do spirit. Is that something that has increased, that we see that the kids are struggling with that, or is that just a constancy that's always been there?
From my perspective, my sense is it's been, I don't know if it's gotten worse or better. I mean, there are conversations that, you know, kids who went through COVID have, you know, they're having social, emotional, and mental health struggles that their predecessors maybe didn't. That varies a bit by country, what exactly sort of the data shows, but I don't know, I guess is my question. that resilience has gotten worse. So I kind of am a bit cautious of sort of having this narrative like, oh, it's all just getting worse and worse. But it is definitely a concern, and it has been for many, for in education research for a long time. But at the same time, when I've been looking into it, one thing I find kind of actually a bit sort of encouraging is actually that, the one thing that research is pretty consistent about that helps kids be resilient is good relationships with adults. If they have at least one, but preferably more, stable, responsive, supportive relationship with an adult that they can rely on, like that it does so much good things for them in terms of resilience, but also in terms of all the social and emotional skills that comprise resilience, like that ability to persist when things get difficult, to think of alternative solutions, to be more inclined to reach outward and get a support and ask for help when you need it. Like that kind of trust, all that really kind of is helped when kids have good relationships with adults. And I think that's a really, I always sort of find like it's kind of, in the one hand, that's always challenging, but to have those sort of relationships, but it's also very encouraging that in some ways the core of it is that simple, perhaps.
I agree that in schools today, there is a lot of talk about resilience, which implies people are under attack or they're going to be under attack. And there's a lot of talk about critical thinking. But if you look at the lives of amazing people, such as the ones we've talked about, they had a different mindset. And their mindset was constructive thinking. So although they could be resilient, they didn't actually just say, well, I'm just going to stand here and take it and, I'll come out the other end. They were constructive thinkers about what they would actually do. And if you read the life stories, the biographies, you see that they come up with an idea and they say, that is something which I'm going to pursue because I believe it is the way in which I can make the best of my life and help other people too. And I'm in the work we're doing, we're saying in the mathematical mode that resilience may be necessary, but it's not in itself sufficient. We have to get kids to say, what is it that I'm going to do with my life, and how am I going to construct a life that is suitable to my personality, suitable to my needs? And some will be commercial. Some will want to go out and make a lot of money. Others will want to go and join a charity and give their life to good works, as one of my good friends has done. Some will want to join a government office and have a very secure life, but they are also working in the needs of the nation. In other words, the interests of everybody would be different. But I've looked at the lives of amazing people, and one thing which to me stands out is they didn't just say, oh, we'll be resilient. They actually came out with a constructive view of what they wanted to do with their time on Earth and went out and used that time to achieve it.
I think that's a wonderful view on it. And sorry, Katerina, I'll interrupt you. But, I think resilience is built. I don't think it's necessarily something that you can learn. And I love the words you used, Katerina, and one was persistence. That is something that you can learn and inspire. And that contributes to resilience. And there was another word that began with T and I can't remember it, sorry. But yeah, sorry.
Trust. I don't know if that was it, but anyway. No, I was just thinking what you're saying, Charles, was such a thoughtful point, because this idea of purpose and meaning, I think that per what you were saying about carriage education, I was saying, I sometimes get the feeling that certain schools or systems are kind of nervous about using terms or talking about character because it's sort of very morally loaded and they're worried of imposing things on other people. But at the flip side of that, there's also a lot of work that shows that, and I see this in my own experience as a teacher, of especially with adolescents and teenagers, having conversation with what gives meaning to you, what is the purpose, and also that the purpose is not just an individualistic, go out and just do what's better, but what's best for you. That is not, and that's not to say that can't be important, but balancing the kind of like thinking about what do you want for yourself, what can you do that is going to motivate you and that is going to add some value to the world, that those two things can be really powerful and important for kids, and especially I think for teenagers. And I think it helps because I guess it has that motivating power. I think that's also what helps them develop the character that you're talking about, and kind of think about, okay, how do I become that amazing person that I admire, who is resilient and constructive and kind of makes the most out of things.
I love that added value that you talk about. Like, how can I bring added value to the world? That's exactly that, with like even community, right? Like, what world do I want to be a part of? Where do I want to be later, further down the line? It's so valuable. I wanted to ask both of you, though, just sort of kind of go on to a bit of a positive note and ask you, what gives you both hope right now in the world of education? Fire ahead, whoever wants to take it.
You want to start, Catherine? Is Catherine there?
Yeah, I'm here. Go ahead, Charles. I'm thinking. I sort of have an idea, but I'm thinking.
All right. What we hope is what we need to create. So I spend a lot of time on hoping, but realizing hope is not sufficient. So it's investment of time, money, energy, and rather than having an idealistic view, I have a view of what would be something which would be helpful for kids to have in order to meet the changing circumstances. So none of us know what will be like in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years time. So back to Darwin, the key concept is adaptability. Can we provide an education where students feel that they can adapt? And I certainly didn't have that education myself. The education I was given was pass the examinations, get a passport, and it'll give you a job. When I got out into the wider world, I suddenly realized that the essence of the game, the name of the game, was adapting to circumstances. And that came from experience. So the more experience we can give students, whether it be virtual experience or real experience, is what the name of the game is. And then giving them the language in order to understand what that experience is and adapt accordingly. If I look at my own life, and I've been very fortunate, there were times when I did not adapt to the situation and I fell behind, or I made assumptions which were incorrect and therefore made the wrong decision for what would have been a better life for myself. Having said that, I made some reasonably good decisions, but I have to say most of it was based upon experience rather than qualifications or knowledge that I'd gained by whatever. And the more I was in situations that tested me, I began to realize that was the real learning. And the guy who probably taught me most theoretically was a guy called Reg Evans, who said, study the action and learn from it, and then act upon that accordingly. Much easier said than done, but I've spent a lot of time with adults, now with students, saying, don't just study the books, don't just pass the examination, study the situation that you're in at the moment, and then use this constructive thinking as how to improve. And if you look at everybody from Mandela, who spent 27 years in prison, he didn't give up on constructive thinking. His whole idea was once he got out of prison, he would construct a much better situation. If you look at people like Harriet Tubman, who spent years as a slave, it was all about the constructive thinking about what she would do when she escaped. If you look at Helen Keller, who was born with all faculties, but sadly got a very serious illness, affected their ability to speak and hear. She didn't give up on constructive thinking about how she could begin to make a contribution. So, in a word, I would say back to Darwin, help the children learn from those situations how to adapt. Easier said than done, but you can only do it if they're in it, if they have the experience and they have the language with people to talk them through how to construct a better life and a better way of doing things.
And what you experience when you're not in your comfort zone, right? That often brings the greatest power potentially. So giving kids as well the opportunity to be in experiences that aren't what they're used to. Katerina, what about you?
I think it's sort of two things. And the first thing I was thinking, well, actually, when you said that, I was like, I can think of several things, which is good. I think the first is the kids. I mean, Charles speaks of adaptability, and it just made me think of like a dozen kids I've taught, and some of them in really difficult circumstances, and just their adaptability, their enthusiasm when you sort of got the right topic maybe, or the right approach, the capacity of human beings to learn is amazing. And so I think I have a lot of hope because of the kids. And but the other thing is, I think maybe it's a bit paradoxical. I'm encouraged the more that the sort of this, like the research, the science of learning, neuroscience, all these things are showing us that it's really about getting the basics right. And it's like, it's not some incredibly complicated thing. It's like teaching a kind of adaptability and resilience. It's about really good relationships. It's about kind of encouraging reflection. It's about helping kids develop this kind of can-do problem-solving attitude. And so I think it's very encouraging that the more we learn about how to do teaching well and how to nurture kids, like the more we realize it's about getting a few basic things right. And if we can do that, then these things like this adaptability that in a way kind of also comes from a sense of confidence. Like, I believe I can do this. When I get out, when I reach this next step, I can find a solution and make it work. Like that comes down to some of these, helping kids develop some of these basic skills, good relationships. Yes, also some like, basic kind of challenges and, like you said, discomfort, like some, putting them in a situation where they have to stretch themselves a little bit, but also equipping them with a sense of confidence and trust, like, I can handle this, I can figure this out, and I know how to ask for help. So I think that's actually a really encouraging thing, because, it's, we know a lot already about how to do this well. It's just kind of reminding ourselves of that and talking to each other about how to make that happen in our respective contexts. And that gives me hope.
Amazing. So finally, I'd like to move on to our tween question today. And that was, why do teachers have to stay quiet about stuff like politics or race, even though we're told to share our opinions? Katerina, would you like to jump in while I've got you?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say really it's out of respect for you guys, you being the tweens and the kids. Like, teachers are, and I say this, having done exactly that in my own classroom, I want to make sure that there's space for you guys to come up with your own thoughts and opinions about these things, because you're often kind of just in the process of figuring that out. And often as a teacher, because you kind of have an authority in the classroom, if I come around and sort of tell you what I think, I'm worried that might actually unintentionally shape your thinking or make you feel like, oh, you can only say certain things and you can't say other things. So actually, it's precisely because and I think this goes for a lot of teachers, because teachers respect kids and want to make sure they get the space to develop their own ideas without a lot of pressure. That's why teachers are quiet and careful about their own opinions. Not that we don't have them, we're just trying to give you guys space.
Charles?
It all relates to a psychology concept called conditioning. And young minds are very open to being conditioned. So I think it was the Jesuits who said, give me the child for 7 years and I'll give you the man. Or in those that was men, it would be, they would give you the women, So in other words, what you are subjected to, what you're conditioned to early in your life, it's very difficult to change later in life. Some people do, but if you're born into a Catholic family, likely is that you will even if you don't go to church, you'll still observe. I was born into a Methodist family, and I still adhere to the principles, even though I don't go to church. In other words, I was conditioned very early in my life to think in a particular way. And the danger for me would be, in answer to your question, if the teachers therefore become agents for a particular religion or a particular political party and start influencing young minds, or rather than doing what I believe they should do, and that is enabling the children to think for themselves, this constructive thinking, rather than conditioning them to a particular approach which the teacher might have, or the priest might have, or the politician might have. I think that's what we have in later life when we hear people preaching or trying to become elected. But in the early years, although kids do become conditioned, I think it is not the role of the teacher to be putting forward political, religious, or any other isms, because the essence of getting an education is to be able to experience a wide background, knowledge, ideas, theories, and make up your own mind.
Yeah, I mean, I would just like to add, I think the trouble is that the environment, the world environment, global environment is quite politically charged. And I think it's a difficult thing for kids to navigate as well. You're potentially in a classroom with kids who's come from families with a very, very different opinion to you of like what you consider democracy, well, whatever. And so I think, that is where that question potentially is also coming from, and I think that is absolutely essential. Of course, that the teacher stays neutral, but very difficult. And I understand that question as well, where it's coming from. Thank you so much to our guests, Katerina and Charles, for joining us today as we explored cultural fluency in education. We hope this conversation has inspired you to think differently about how we connect across cultures and why it truly matters. Cultural fluency isn't just for international schools overseas, it's essential for every school and every community. In a world more connected than ever, it's the foundation of being a true global citizen, helping us understand one another better, build respect, and create spaces where everyone feels seen and valued. It's an ongoing journey that calls for curiosity, empathy, and a willingness to listen beyond our own experiences. We hope you feel inspired to listen more closely, be more curious, and celebrate that rich diversity all around us. We're so glad that you've been part of this conversation. Keep exploring, keep learning, and most importantly, keep informing those perspectives.